Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into something that might sound a little intimidating at first, but trust me, it's really fascinating stuff. We're talking about these things called dichotomous moderators in multiple regression.
Yeah.
It might sound like a mouthful, but I promise you don't need a PhD in statistics to get it.
Right.
Think about it this way,
Yeah.
okay? Imagine you're trying to predict, say, how well someone's going to do in a race, right?
Yeah.
You might think about how much they train, how much natural talent they've got.
Mm-hmm.
But what if the impact of that training, whether all that hard work really pays off, is actually different for men versus women?
Yeah.
Well, that, my friends, that right there is a dichotomous moderator in action. It's that extra layer, that extra factor that can change the whole story.
Exactly.
So we're going to be taking a closer look at a research article that really dug deep into this back in 1994. It's by a Guinness, pronounced like the beer.
Like the beer.
Guinness, Pierce, and Stone Romero, and it was published in the journal Educational and Psychological Measurement. And let me tell you, these researchers, they were tackling a pretty tough problem that a lot of researchers were facing back then.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one. So, researchers, they often want to figure out how a moderator variable, like gender, like you were saying, or maybe teaching style,
Right.
how these things influence the connection between a predictor variable and an outcome. Like, for example, how does the amount of time a student spends studying, that's your predictor,
Mm-hmm.
affect their test scores? That's your outcome, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then does something like gender change that relationship at all?
Yeah, so these moderators, they can really shake things up. They can totally change how we interpret those results, right?
Absolutely.
And so this article, it zeroes in on a particularly tricky problem. Researchers had ways to deal with continuous moderators, things like age, which can take on a whole range of values. But when it came to dichotomous moderators, the ones with just two categories, like male or female, well, figuring out the statistical power to detect their effects, that was a whole different ballgame.
Completely different. And, that power thing, that's super important. It's basically the probability of actually finding a real effect in your research if it really exists out there in the world.
Oh, okay.
Like, imagine you're baking a cake and you're missing a crucial ingredient, but your measuring spoons aren't sensitive enough to tell you that. You end up with a wonky cake. Same with research. Low power. You might miss crucial insight.
Oh, I see. It's like you could miss something really important just because your study wasn't designed to be sensitive enough.
Exactly.
So Guinness and his colleagues, they wanted to make sure researchers wouldn't miss these crucial moderator effects, right?
All right.
Just because their studies weren't, powerful enough to pick up on them.
And their solution. Pretty clever, especially for back then. They developed a whole computer program just for researchers to use to estimate the power they'd need when they were dealing with these dichotomous moderators.
Hold on, a computer program. Back in 1994.
Oh, yeah.
That's pretty ahead of its time. So tell me, how did this thing actually work?
All right, so picture this, right? Researchers, they're sitting there with their floppy disks, their bulky computers, and they're feeding in all this information about their study into this program. Things like the size of their sample, the expected correlations between the variables, and of course, all the details about the dichotomous moderator they were looking at.
Good.
And then the program, it would churn away,
Mhm.
crunch all those numbers, and finally it would give them an estimate of the statistical power they needed, to be reasonably sure they could actually detect the moderator's effect if it was really there.
So it was basically like giving researchers this special tool to make sure their studies were robust enough to actually uncover those hidden relationships that might be lurking in the data, right?
Exactly. Like a magnifying glass for their research. It was all
Hmm.
about helping them design better studies, more effective ones, and avoid jumping to the wrong conclusions.
That's amazing. I mean, it's incredible to think about how far research has come since then, but I bet you're curious about how we do power analysis these days.
Oh,
Right?
absolutely. Buckle up, because things have definitely changed a bit since the days of floppy disks.
I mean, it's really cool to think about how researchers back then were already grappling with all these statistical challenges. But before we jump ahead to today and how we do things now, can you maybe give us an example, like a real world example? What could happen if we miss a dichotomous moderator? Like what kind of wrong conclusions might we end up with?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Let's say researchers are studying a new drug for blood pressure, right? And they find, oh, hey, this seems to work pretty well overall. But then what if when they take a closer look and they factor in something like ethnicity as a moderator, they discover something really important?
Like what?
Like, what if they discover the drug is way less effective for a certain ethnic group?
Oh, wow.
If they just ignore that, well, that could have huge implications, right? For healthcare decisions, that could even put certain patients at risk.
That's a pretty powerful example.
Oh, yeah.
So if a study didn't have enough power to detect that, that ethnic background was playing a role in thinking, well, the drug worked, they might totally miss that crucial detail and just recommend the drug for everyone.
Exactly. And that's where Guinness and his colleagues, that's where their work comes in. Their program helped researchers design studies that were actually able to detect these really important differences, and ultimately lead to better decisions, better outcomes for everyone.
So even though the program itself might be, a little outdated now, that
Yeah.
core idea,
Yeah,
by making sure your study is sensitive enough to pick up on those moderator effects,
right.
that's timeless.
Oh, absolutely. It's totally timeless. And the good news is we've come a long way since 1994, right?
Oh, I bet.
No more floppy disks, no more bulky computers. We've got these sophisticated statistical software programs now that can handle all sorts of complex analyses, including, power calculations for all kinds of different research designs.
It's amazing. So anyone out there listening who's thinking about doing research, they should definitely, dive into those modern tools.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But even for those of us who, who aren't exactly crunching numbers in a lab every day, understanding this concept of dichotomous moderators, it can be a really valuable tool, right?
It really can be.
For thinking critically about the information we come across all the time, every day.
Absolutely. It helps you ask the right questions. When you see data or research findings. Like, for example, let's say you come across a headline that says, new study shows drinking coffee boosts productivity. Before you just accept that, take it at face value, you might want to stop and think, hold on, did they even consider things like age or gender? What about pre-existing sleep habits? Could those things be affecting the relationship between coffee and productivity?
That's a great point. So it's not just about, reading a research finding and just believing it.
Right.
It's about digging a little deeper, looking for those hidden patterns, those variations within the data that might suggest a moderator is at play.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond the surface.
Yeah.
Questioning those assumptions and thinking about different subgroups. And that's so important, especially in a world where we're just like bombarded with information from all sides.
I really love how this deep dive, it's not just about, explaining this statistical concept.
Yeah.
It's actually, it's empowered us,
Yeah.
right, to be more discerning. Like we can actually be smarter about how we consume information.
Right.
So as we start wrapping things up here, what's one key takeaway you really want to leave our listeners with today?
I'd say just remember, data is rarely one size fits all. Always be on the lookout for those dichotomous moderators, those hidden variables that can really change how we understand relationships, how we understand trends. They're out there more than you might think.
That is such a valuable insight. And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dive into this world of dichotomous moderators. I hope you all found it as interesting as we did. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through all this.
My pleasure.
And to all of you, our amazing listeners, thank you for joining us. Until next time, keep those minds curious, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive. It's pretty amazing to think that even back then, in 1994, researchers like Guinness, they were already, really emphasizing this idea, like looking beyond the surface of the data. It really shows you how important it is to consider those subgroups, those different perspectives when we're analyzing information.
Yeah, it's really remarkable how this message is even more relevant today than it was back then. I mean, think about it. With all this big data everywhere, we're just constantly bombarded with statistics and research findings. It's so easy to just get swept up in the headlines, but we really got to remember, those top-level results, they might not be telling the whole story.
Right, exactly. It's like that saying, don't believe everything you read, or in this case, don't believe everything you see in a statistic. We've got to dig deeper, think critically, and consider all those potential moderators that might be, lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly. Think of it like you're exploring this vast uncharted territory, right? You might come across this glittering stream, but if you don't go any further, you might miss the hidden cave. The one that's filled with even more dazzling treasures. And those treasures, in our case, well, those are the nuanced insights that are hidden within those subgroups.
I love that analogy. It really highlights how important it is to be curious.
Right.
To not just settle for those superficial interpretations of the data. It's like we're all like explorers in this age of information. We've got the tools, we've got the knowledge. We can uncover those hidden gems of insight.
Yeah, and you know what? The most powerful tool in your exploration kit, the simple question, what if? What if this relationship changes when we consider gender? What if the outcome is different for people from different, socioeconomic backgrounds? Asking those what if questions, that can lead you to a much richer, a much more accurate understanding of everything around you, the
Yeah.
world.
So it's not even just about understanding, statistical concepts like these dichotomous moderators.
Right.
It's about cultivating that inquisitive spirit, right? That drive to look beyond the obvious, uncover the hidden stories within the data.
Absolutely. And by doing that, you won't just be a more informed citizen. You'll also be able to make better decisions in your own life.
Right.
Whether you're evaluating a new business opportunity or making choices about your healthcare, or even just trying to wrap your head around, the complexities of the world around you, considering those potential moderators can really make all the difference.
That is so well said. And on that empowering note,
Hmm.
I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into this fascinating world of dichotomous moderators. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure exploring this with you.
The pleasure was all mine.
And remember, dear listeners, keep those minds curious and never stop exploring. You never know what amazing insights you might uncover.